So again, welcome. Our webinar today is covering the interim final rule on non-congregate summer meals and specifically what it means for you this summer. I do want to preface this all by saying USDA has done an official webinar about the interim final rule that was specific for sponsors. They had another one specific for state agencies. So if you do want to hear similar content kind of straight from USDA's mouth, that does exist, and we can provide a link to that. But hopefully this is helpful, a little bit more of an informal setting, hopefully answering maybe a few more questions and things that have come up since they did those webinars initially, and talking a little bit again about the implications in a way that maybe USDA didn't quite cover in their webinar, but do just want to highlight that. And also that we are not USDA, we are also not a state agency. So in all sorts of things, it's always best to check in with your state agency before you run ahead and do something. But hopefully this information is really helpful for you knowing what your options might be and what are the kinds of things you could bring to your state agency. So a brief note on housekeeping though, we will share the slide deck and the recording via email afterwards. I see some of you are already engaging in the chat, which is great. If you are just signing on and you want to write something to share with not just us, the panelists, but also with your fellow attendees, please use the chat function. If you have a specific question that you want us to address at the end during the Q&A, please use the Q&A box. That'll help us keep everything straight. We can also type some answers as we go throughout the presentation today. And if you would like closed captioning, we do have that available. You see there on the black box there on the screen, it's the live transcript button that you can click if you want to get that closed captioning. All right, and just for our agenda today, we've already done our opening. I'll introduce my colleagues who are speaking with me today in just a moment. Then I'll go into some background on non-congregate and why it's important and an exciting opportunity. Then we'll give an overview of the interim final rule, and then we will have Regis come in and talk about our No Kid Hungry Summer Meals eligibility map, which is an exciting tool that we have to support you all in planning. And then I'll come back and talk about how you can comment on the interim final rule, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. But again, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation today. So as things are top of mind, you can put them in, and again, we may be able to answer them as we go as well. Okay. Now that I've been speaking at you for like 5 minutes already, hi, I'm Carolyn Vega. I'm the Associate Director of Policy Analysis for Share Our Strength's No Kid Hungry campaign. And I am joined today by my colleague, Zach Tilley. He's a Senior Policy Manager. He has been helping out a lot over the past year since the Consolidated Appropriations Act passed, and then since the interim final rule and supporting on some of our resources and guidance that we've put out. And we're also thrilled to have Regis Whaley with us. He's our Senior Program Manager who works a lot on tech and school meals modernization, and a lot of that work has focused on direct certification and CEP. But because he's our tech wizard on the team, he's also worked on our eligibility map. All right. So background on non-congregate summer meals. As I'm sure many of you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. Summer is the hungriest time of year when kids lose access to free and reduced price school meals. And we know from research that we've done and research that others have done that families do spend more on groceries during the summer when their kids don't have access to those school meals. We know families struggle to spend that extra money and they struggle to make ends meet, and more families struggle with food security over the summer months. The traditional summer meals programs, the Summer Food Service Program and the National School Lunch Program's Seamless Summer Option, SFSP and SSO, have long failed to meet this high need during the summer. And in 2019, the last summer before the pandemic, just 1 in 7 kids who got free or reduced price school meals got a summer meal. So really not even coming close to matching that level of need and what the programs were always intended to do, which was to take the place of school meals over the summer. In a lot of ways, it's because the summer meals programs were set up to be like the school meals program, assuming that kids could come together in one place and eat each meal together in one place every single day. But kids aren't in school over the summer. And we know again from research that we and others have done that a lot of kids are at home over the summer, whether with their parents, a grandparent, another caregiver, a sibling, maybe they're just on their own. And some of that is family preference, but a lot of times it's also just the availability of high quality summer programming. That programming may not be affordable or accessible. That programming may not even last the full summer, even if it is there for some of it. And even for the places that kids may get together outside of formal programming, like parks or pools and libraries and rec centers, there can still be a lot of transportation with barriers with getting there, especially again, every day or maybe twice a day for that full summer, conflicts with parents' work schedules, lack of public transportation, things like that. There can also be weather issues with outdoor sites, safety concerns, a lot of things that are keeping kids from getting these meals that they need over the summer. And so many barriers that, we've just said for a long time that structurally these programs just aren't set up to meet the need that's there over the summer. So because this is a long-standing problem, there have been pilots to address this gap that go back more than a decade. So Congress authorized pilots and they tested out different ways of doing non-congregate meals, again, of things that were outside that normal group setting meal. And they also pilot tested summer EBT, which was a grocery benefit that worked similar to SNAP or WIC that was provided to families with kids eligible for free or reduced price meals. But by and large, these were all pretty small scale in select areas that may not have run every single summer. But in response to COVID-19, when congregate meals, eating all together in one place was no longer safe, there were a lot of new models tested much more broadly. So we saw a lot of meal program flexibilities that allowed for non-congregate, grab and go, home delivery, all of that. But those wound down around spring, summer of 2022. And then there was also pandemic EBT, loosely modeled on summer EBT that was a grocery benefit for kids missing school meals, but that wound down after summer 2023. So to permanently address this gap that had been maybe temporarily addressed in some ways during the pandemic, in December 2022, Congress permanently authorized 2 new summer nutrition options nationwide: non-congregate summer meals in rural areas, which is what we're talking about today, first available last summer, and then summer EBT, which will begin this summer. And the important thing to note is that both of these new options are intended to work alongside the traditional summer meals programs. SFSP and SFSO have not gone away. The traditional congregate model is still there. Non-congregate summer meals is intended to be a complement to that, where there are no congregate sites. You could have non-congregate, and summer EBT is kind of an add-on or an on top of, where you can get a summer meal, whether congregate or non-congregate, and still receive summer EBT. Just knowing that an all of the above approach is really needed to meet families and communities where they are and meet this need that there exists over the summer. So what is in this law that Congress passed in December 2022? And I think it's important to start with the law because a lot of times people can blame USDA or blame their state agencies, and a lot of times it goes back to what Congress allowed them to do. And I think the biggest piece right here is that non-congregate meals are only available in rural areas with no congregate service. The law did not say exactly what it meant to be rural, and we'll get to that, but some way, shape, or form, USDA has to limit this option to rural areas. And this was done because we know that all of the barriers that exist to summer meals are amplified in rural communities. We know they don't only exist in rural communities, unfortunately, but they do have that highest need for this level of service to be able to meet the need. Another element laid out in the law is that there's the option for the usual area eligibility rules that exist in the summer meals programs, or an option for what are called conditional sites outside of area eligible locations. The name conditional sites wasn't used in the law. That was put later in regulation, but the premise was laid out there pretty clearly in the law that you could serve meals outside of area eligible locations to individually eligible kids. The law makes it pretty clear that all of the usual health, safety, sanitation, and meal pattern rules are intended to apply to non-congregate meals, just like congregate meals, but it does allow for meals to be provided for up to 10 days at a time, as long as everyone's following the usual daily per child limits of no more than a breakfast and a lunch per child per day, or a combination of a meal and a snack. Other things in the law related to the administration of the non-congregate option. Congress permitted implementation last summer in 2023 based on past pilot guidance. However, I will note that because the pilots, again, were on such a smaller scale and followed lots of different models as they were testing out what worked, that there wasn't really a fully developed body of guidance ready to go. So it did require USDA to kind of put out a lot at the last minute, which I know made last summer a big challenge in a lot of ways. But it was available, at least in a limited way, last summer. But the law directed USDA to issue an interim final rule by December of this past year, 2023. And a quick note, we'll discuss this a little bit more at the end about commenting. An interim final rule is kind of this special case of how government regulations can be issued. Usually there's a proposed rule, the public comments, the government takes that into account, they issue a final rule, then the final rule goes into effect, and that's what everyone has to follow. But because of the condensed time frame of wanting these rules to be out in time for summer 2024, Congress allowed USDA to do an interim final rule that would take immediate effect, but still be open for public comment with the option of revising it for a final rule at some point in the future. So that's a little bit about what an interim final rule, or IFR, is, because I know we talk about that a lot here. Other things in the law are for state agencies that there was optional opt-in for summer 2023, but non-congregate plans are just included in the usual summer management and administration plan for this summer and beyond, which kind of makes it something that should be available nationwide and not subject to a state opting in or out each summer. And it also states in the law that agencies are expected to identify areas with no congregate service and encourage non-congregate service in priority areas. To one of the questions that was in the chat at the very beginning, that doesn't mean that states are obligated to identify a minimum of some number of sponsors per square mileage, but at least there is some expectation that states are looking at areas that have no service and trying to figure out a way to encourage non-congregate service there where there are gaps. Okay, the IFR that we keep talking about, what's actually in it? So briefly, I'll just start off and say that in the IFR, it's clear that the non-congregate option is available through both the Summer Food Service Program and the Seamless Summer option, and related that it's available to both public and private nonprofit organizations, as well as school food authorities, whether for schools you're operating SFSP or SSO. The IFR does allow new sponsors to do non-congregate, so your state shouldn't have a rule that you have to be an experienced sponsor on congregate operations in order to get started with non-congregate. And a state cannot deny a sponsor in good standing solely because of intent to provide non-congregate service, although states do have the discretion to some extent of ensuring you're in good standing. That's defined in the regulation. And then also just generally determining if you as a specific sponsor have the capacity to take on non-congregate service in the way you're proposing. But by and large, there can't be some kind of blanket ban of, no one's allowed to do non-congregate in our state, or no nonprofits can do non-congregate in our state. Again, it can't be denied solely on the basis because you want to do non-congregate, and the same would go for a site as well. Okay, the next big piece of the IFR is what it means to be rural, because again, that was a big piece laid out in the law that the IFR had to really define. So for this one, I will turn it over to my colleague, Zach.
Great, so I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the most exciting pieces of the IFR, which is the expanded definition of rural. On the maps on this slide, you can really see the effects, how much more land area is covered by the new definition than the old. So compare the unshaded area on the left to the area shaded in green on the right, and you can get a sense of how much more expansive the new definition is. Next slide. Thanks. So here you can see the old definition and the new definition side by side. In 2023, only areas in a county that were not part of a metropolitan statistical area based on the OMB's definition were considered rural by default. And to supplement this pretty narrow definition, USDA allowed for rural pocket determinations based on a number of other metrics, including RUCA, that's the USDA Economic Research Services Rural Urban Commuting Area Codes, RUC, UIC, and Census Bureau determinations. The Census Bureau data is what underlies the NCES locale classifications that I know a lot of people used in 2023. And because there were a lot of rural pocket requests expected and received in 2023, USDA set a relatively low bar for accepting those determinations. Basically, if you could demonstrate that an area was rural based on, RUCA or RUC, USDA would accept that. In 2024 and going forward, the rural definition is much more expansive by default. It now includes OMB, RUCA, RUC, UIC, and the Census Bureau defined urban areas that you can see on the NCES map, among many other mapping tools. And it also includes areas that are not considered part of an urban area at the discretion of the secretary. So that's special cases, probably pretty rare. The standard for, well, let me say, rural pockets may still be approved. The standard for USDA acceptance is higher now. So they now have to approve rather than concur with a rural pocket determination. And any request for a rural pocket has to be supported by data. USDA hasn't provided real examples or enumerated a list of data that could be provided to support rural pocket applications under this new regime. So to the extent that they're necessary, it's probably necessary to get a little bit creative with the quantitative data that you present in support of a rural pocket determination. And then this isn't on the slide, but I'll just say that sites and state agencies should use the information contained in the FNS rural designation map to make designations about whether sites qualify as rural. There will be a lot more on those mapping tools a little later in the webinar. But once a site establishes its rural designation, that designation is effective for a period of 5 years. So once you qualify as rural, you don't have to make another rural determination for 5 years unless there's a special case, and that special case is sometimes at the discretion of the state agency. Redetermination prior to the 5-year period can be required if a state agency determines that an area's rural status has changed significantly since the previous determination. So it'd be like, pretty sudden and rapid exurban development out into rural areas, for example. But in general, determinations are good for 5 years. And now I'll pass it back to Carolyn for some more aspects of the IFR.
All right. Thank you, Zach, for being my rural definition guru. But there are a lot more elements of the IFR, so I'll handle those. So I guess the other big piece when determining site eligibility to offer non-congregate is that there's no congregate service. For better or worse, that was largely left to state agency discretion in the IFR. So there's nothing in the regulation that says you have to be at least a mile away from a congregate site in order to do non-congregate service. So nothing to that effect. But agencies are encouraged to consider factors like physical conditions or other barriers like a highway or something else like that, that might mean even if a congregate site is a quarter of a mile away, that kids can't really access that. States are also encouraged to consider the congregate site capacity and whether or not they're really reaching the full community, as well as whether the sites are serving the same children, but on different days or weeks throughout the summer, or for different meals on the same day, like breakfast versus lunch. And whether the site appeals to a specific age group or to children with unique dietary requirements. So if, for example, it was a congregate site, but it was at the teen center in the library, that maybe it would be appropriate to still offer non-congregate meals for younger kids who are unlikely to be wandering into that teen center for a congregate meal, as an example. The IFR does go into some more detail on what we might call hybrid sites, or sites that are offering both congregate and non-congregate service at the same location. And the IFR does say that is permitted as long as the site is providing meals for different days. So, common example, you're doing your standard congregate service Monday through Friday or Monday through Thursday, and then you provide some take-home meals to cover the weekend. Or it could be offering different meals, like doing a congregate lunch in conjunction with some programming, but then offering a breakfast for kids to take home for the following day. Could be covering different periods of time. We know a lot of camps and programs and summer schools and things like that are only running for maybe a few weeks or a month at a time. So then those sites could then offer non-congregate meals to cover the rest of the summer. And then the kind of big piece that's maybe a bigger question mark on how this works is serving different groups of children at different times. The IFR is quite clear that under no circumstance should you be providing a congregate meal and a non-congregate meal at the same time. But assuming you had different service times, that you could have both a congregate lunch and a non-congregate lunch at the same site, as long as you can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the state agency that you're serving different groups of kids and you have a system in place to ensure that there's no duplication, because the overall goal is to make sure that kids are getting the appropriate number of meals per day and not getting more than the allowable number of meals per day. So it should be no more than one breakfast and one lunch per child per day, and you shouldn't be getting a congregate lunch followed by a non-congregate lunch to take home. Service flexibilities. I thought this was an exciting element of the IFR because we know there were a lot of limitations put on these service flexibilities last summer. The IFR says that for 2024 and going forward, states can only limit these flexibilities on a case-by-case basis based on concerns about a sponsor's specific capacity to administer them. So those are parent or guardian meal pickup without an eligible child present, multiple meal distribution, saying that's allowable for up to 10 days at a time, or bulk meal item distribution, saying that's allowable for up to 5 days at a time. There are some caveats in all of this. For parent or guardian meal pickup, there is expected to be some kind of system in place to ensure that the adult has an eligible child. But in everything that we've heard from USDA, that, this isn't like show a birth certificate or anything like that, that this isn't meant to be a formal guardian. It could be any kind of caregiver, whether that's an older sibling or a grandparent, or something like that over the summer, that would be fine. So while there may need to be some kind of system of whether that's a sign-in sheet or asking where the kids go to school, that's something I kind of heard different sponsors do during the pandemic. There should be some kind of way that the sponsor and site are ensuring that these adults do have eligible children that they're bringing the meals to. On multiple meal distribution, as a distinction from bulk meals, this would be for unitized meals that generally have all of the components for one meal grouped together. That the kind of default is, again, for up to 10 days at a time. But there's state agency discretion, again, for less if there's integrity or food safety concerns with that. And one thing I'll note, because 10 days at a time sometimes feels pretty funky to people, like then you're distributing on a different day of the week every time. And that I think 10 days is maybe more envisioned to be like every 2 weeks to cover 5 days for 2 weeks at a time than versus like 10 days continuously. But it could come into play if, an example USDA has given, you had a congregate in-person program that's ending and you're going to provide 10 days worth of meals on the last day to kind of send kids off with, because you'll no longer be operating for the rest of the summer. Bulk meal items, USDA has their own guidance, and I'll provide some links to some USDA websites and other resources about bulk meal items. This is more of when you provide a loaf of bread and a pack of lunch meat and a box of salad greens rather than individual sandwiches. And for reasons that don't make complete sense to me personally, USDA has said that the default on that is for 5 days at a time, with state agency discretion to allow more days, up to 10 days at a time. So, at least those options are more widely available than they often were last summer, but still with some caveats and specific things to work through with your state agency and your specific plan. Okay, service models. These weren't explicitly all laid out in the IFR, but are very much implied throughout in the way things are discussed. But non-congregate allows for things like walk-up distribution. And we know in some cases that maybe even some schools were serving non-congregate meals out of their cafeteria where kids could walk through a line and they pick their items and then they just take it home. There can also be what we saw quite frequently during the pandemic of a curbside pickup or a drive-through where you go to that distribution point of the library or the school or something else, the church, and someone just puts a box in your trunk with, maybe a week's worth of meals and you go on. Mobile meals, which is a model that has been used for congregate meals in the past, can also work well for non-congregate, getting a little bit closer to where people live to overcome some transportation barriers. So you're following a mobile route and stopping periodically and distributing meals at predetermined points along this route at a given time so people can come up. And rather than in the congregate world, having to sit and eat their meal on a bus or by the bus, instead kids can just get those meals and take them home, whether for one day or again, a week or something like that. And then home delivery is permitted. And the IFR goes through a few more details on this one. It does require advance consent or opt-in rather than the other models that could be completely kind of drop-in or open. And that's just based on the nature of it to make sure that you really are reaching families that want this service before you're just going out and dropping food on a doorstep. And you do also have to confirm contact information and the number of eligible children and have that on file before you initiate those deliveries. Home delivery is available to both nonprofit and school food authority sponsors. I know there was a little bit of back and forth in the guidance about this last year, that nonprofits could only do it if they had an agreement with the school, but that is not the case. Nonprofits only need an agreement if they're utilizing school data to identify and invite families to sign up for home delivery. But if you have other ways of contacting families and getting that opt-in as a nonprofit, you do not need to be working with the school food authority necessarily. Some additional details, meal service distribution or delivery times must still be specified, similar to meal service times needing to be specified for congregate sites. However, non-congregate sites are exempted from the requirement that breakfast be served in the morning or for there to be 1 hour between meal service distribution. So again, you could distribute a breakfast and a lunch at the same time, meals for multiple days at the same time. Second meals are not permitted to be claimed for reimbursement through non-congregate. As you may know, congregate sites, there's a complicated rule that you can serve additional meals to kids as long as you're not claiming more than 2% of them for reimbursement over the course of a claim month. But none of that is permitted in non-congregate. It is strictly 1 meal per meal service per child. And then the usual area eligibility rules apply to distribution sites or homes that are being delivered to, unless you are operating what is now known as a conditional site. And I'm going to talk more about that when we did our summer nutrition summit and we're talking with state agencies and USDA back in January. This raised a lot of questions, so I want to talk a little bit more about it. So again, usual area eligibility rules apply to non-congregate in the same way they apply to congregate sites, again, except for this kind of carve out for conditional sites. So again, in most cases, you're going to be in an area where at least half of the kids qualify for free or reduced price meals based on school or census data. But we do know that there are a lot of areas that don't meet that threshold, and especially a lot of rural areas that don't meet that threshold. So enter the conditional site option. I will say this is permitted only for rural non-congregate. So you can't do a congregate conditional site, and you can't do conditional sites in non-rural areas. But it is an option that exists now. And so this allows you to operate outside of those areas that meet that usual 50% threshold for open sites. And you similarly don't have to meet a 50% threshold through applications or enrollment like you would at a closed enrolled site. The catch, if you will, is that the site only receives reimbursement for meals served to children who are determined individually eligible for free or reduced price meals. So for a nonprofit sponsor doing this, they would have to collect applications, or have an agreement with a school to obtain school data, or the school could be relying on its own data to figure this out. So because of this, there are a couple of kind of considerations here. One, you may obtain eligibility information after serving a meal as long as you obtain that information within the claim month. That's just based on usual rules of when determinations become effective based on when a parent signs that application. But the kind of catch is there, well, what if you do if you serve a meal to a kid and they never bring that application back, or it comes back and the family doesn't meet that threshold for free or reduced price meals? Sites are permitted to charge for meals served to children who aren't eligible. And that would follow the rules that currently exist for camps that may charge separately for meals. Or a site may use non-program or private funds to provide no-cost meals to ineligible children. But all of this does definitely present some additional considerations and potentially some additional logistics. One, again, of gathering that eligibility information, and two, figuring out how you're going to handle meals for kids who may not be eligible. It could be some kind of like invite-only outreach system, although that would work better for schools that kind of know that information in advance. Again, figuring out what kind of funding you might have available to cover meals, or again, setting up in advance and communicating clearly any system for charging for meals. So again, things to consider with this model, but this site type, again, does exist for those areas that you just can't get to qualify under usual rules. All right, and then I'll say a word about monitoring, that by and large, it follows the usual rules for the summer food service program or seamless summer option. They have their own set of monitoring rules. Again, with the seamless summer option kind of mirroring National School Lunch Program monitoring more than SFSP. But the important thing to note here is that sites that are switching from congregate to non-congregate, say they did congregate service last summer, but this summer they're going to do non-congregate, they will be considered new sites for monitoring purposes. So that adds in those extra requirements around visits and things like that. So important to consider that just because a site has been a wonderful congregate site for a decade, they'll get to be considered a new site if they switch to non-congregate service. And a lot of the guidance from USDA lays out some more things about things that sponsors could or should look at, just given the different experience that will happen at a non-congregate distribution site or along a home delivery route versus a usual congregate site. So speaking of lots of USDA resources, I do have a link up here for summer EBT information in case you're interested, but most of these links do pertain to summer broadly and non-congregate as well. And that last link there to the Sun Style Guide refers to these logos that I have up on the screen. USDA has rebranded the summer nutrition programs to kind of put them all under this umbrella of summer nutrition that now includes congregate, non-congregate, and summer EBT. So the overall brand is Sun or Summer Up Nutrition. So traditional congregate meals would be Sun Meals. Non-congregate meals is Sun Meals to Go. And summer EBT is Sun Bucks. States aren't obligated to use this branding, so you may or may not see this in your state, but I just wanted to show this in case you see this pop up and you're like, what is this? Is this a completely separate program from what I've heard about? And no, this is just new branding for, again, traditional congregate summer meals, non-congregate, and summer EBT. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Regis to talk about our summer meals eligibility map.
Thanks, Carolyn, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Glad to have this opportunity to talk with you about the map today. So there is one map, but it's got two different layers on there, and I will talk through really the non-congregate summer meals rural eligibility piece of that today. There's a link on the slide here. I'm going to drop it in the chat also. So want to say at this point, if you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is there in the chat also. there's plenty of things to look at on a map, lots of things that can be confusing, but I will walk through all of it today. And like I said, if you have any questions afterwards, more than happy to answer those things for you. But again, our map has two layers to it, the non-congregate and the rural layer, and then also the averaged eligibility piece. The idea here was that we know that as you're putting together a summer strategy, we know that it's not just SFSP congregate meals on one side and non-congregate on the other. These are things that you're planning together now. So it's helpful to have a map in one place that shows both pieces of information, and that's the intention of the map here. Next slide, please. So just to talk through just the rural piece of the map, I want to say in answering the question in the Q&A from Lynn regarding whether or not USDA has like approved our map or anything like that. This is literally their data. I've just pulled it over into this map so that all of the rural data as well as the other eligibility data all lives in one place. So this is literally USDA's map just shown on our website. So there is, when these slides go out, the link that's there that says rural designation map, you can see that that will link to USDA's map. It's that green chunk that Zach was showing earlier. It's the same thing, just the layout looks a little bit different. So know that the data that you're seeing with respect to whether or not a location is rural is literally from USDA. So within the map, if you go into it, it's relatively straightforward to use. Again, there's the two layers on the map. If you're interested in looking at just the rurality data, there is a layer of the map called USDA rural designations. Again, that's straight from USDA. You'll want to make sure that just that is turned on. You'll be able to, from there, search for an address and then just click on the area that's near the address once you find it. I should also say too that it's not necessarily just an address. Like it's just like if you would go Google anything, you know, if you just know the name of the place that you're looking for, you can also just type that in. And then the mapping software will show you a list of locations. But yeah, you search for it, click on the map, and then the most important thing is just looking for the pop-up, and you can see an example of that on the right side of the screen. So there's a pop-up that will come up that literally says this area is designated as rural. The idea here was that the map from USDA is really like it's designed to be that same thing, that big massive green. It's just that's all the rural area, and so that's basically what we've mirrored here. What I will call out here is that there is this object ID that comes up. This isn't really anything you need to worry about. Again, this map layer comes straight from USDA. It's all the same areas that they have labeled as rural. The intention behind this at this point has been just to be able to identify within USDA's map, like this is the specific piece of the map that says that this is rural. So in USDA's map, like in the background, every place that's identified as rural has its own unique identifier associated with it. What you see in the screenshot here is what that unique identifier is. Some places have multiple identifiers because, as Zach was explaining, there's a lot of different ways that a place can be identified as rural now. So there might be multiple object IDs that show up in there to say that it's rural in, you know, up to one of those 4 ways. The long story short is click on the location, make sure you see this area is designated as rural, and you're on your way. So that's all for the rural eligibility piece of the map. Like I said earlier, if you have any questions, comments, things you'd like to see in the map, all those things, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Thanks.
Thank you, Regis, for making this map possible. I think there was a note in the chat of like, how did you even do this? We would love to do this. And I will let you handle that because I have absolutely no clue. It's all wizardry to me. All right. Moving on, then our next piece is commenting on the IFR. So important dates. The interim final rule was published on December 29th, 2023, and it took effect immediately. Again, this is that oddity of an interim final rule versus the usual process of a proposed rule. So it took effect immediately upon its publication, but unlike a final rule, it is still open for public comment through April 29th, 2024. So you can submit a comment on or before April 29th. A final rule, TBD, USDA isn't under any kind of congressional or regulatory timeframe at this point for issuing a final rule. I suspect they will wait to get through this summer and see a little bit more about how it goes before really formulating anything, but it's their option to wait 2 years or 5 years or anything like that before doing a final rule. And then similarly, the effective date of that final rule is TBD. It could go into effect immediately upon its publication, or USDA could set some other effective date for one or more provisions within it. So the comment process. So first, review the IFR. We've discussed a lot today, but no substitute for going back through it. Unfortunately, it is very long, but the non-congregate section itself isn't terrible. There's also the provisions about summer EBT in there that make it quite long. We have some tips on how to submit a comment letter in response to a proposed rule or interim final rule that are pretty general to any kind of comment opportunity. I guess one thing I will note at this time, we're not planning to do a template comment letter. In general, USDA and any federal agency would tell you that while they are legally obligated to kind of read a template letter and take it into account, they do not carry as much weight as an individual comment based on your personal or professional experience. So it's not some kind of like democratic majority vote process that as long as, you know, more people said do X, they have to do X. If they had someone say, you know, based on this experience and everything I know, for all of these reasons, I think you should do Y, they are within their rights to say, yeah, we're going to do Y, even though all these people told us to do X. So just to kind of note on the oddity of generally of the rulemaking process and regulatory comments. And then whenever you're ready and you've kind of got those thoughts based on your personal or professional experience, you can go ahead and submit a formal comment. You can access it via the same page with the IFR on that first link. You can also access it via regulations.gov there at that other link. You can either type into a kind of comment box that they have there or upload an attachment if you want to write a letter in a Word document or something like that. And so again, I would really encourage you, if you have thoughts about this, if you're a sponsor on the ground and maybe you did this last year or during the pandemic, or maybe you're, you know, struggling to figure out how different things work this year with the current guidance, this is the time to make your thoughts known to USDA. Again, it's not a majority vote process, but they are legally required to read all of the comments and take them into consideration when developing a final rule. Okay. With that, Q&A. I know we've got a lot of things in the chat. We have a couple of questions, but please go ahead if you have something that you've been thinking of or something you just thought of to go ahead and enter that into the Q&A. And I guess I have a question for all of you, which you can drop in the chat, which is there something you would want to change in the IFR before a final rule? So would love to see you all drop that in the chat. That's really helpful for us as we think about what our comment will be as an organization. Okay, so with that, some questions that we've gotten so far. Is there a difference in reimbursement for congregate versus non-congregate meals? This is actually somewhat complicated because in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. There isn't a separate or a special rate just for non-congregate. However, because non-congregate is only available in rural areas, non-congregate meals will always qualify for that higher reimbursement rate that's set for rural or self-prep sites. So you could have congregate sites that qualify for that rate because they're self-prep or they're rural, but you could have urban vended sites that would have a lower reimbursement rate. So it's a little bit yes and no. It's not a specific non-congregate rate, but because non-congregate meals are only available in rural areas, they always get that higher rural rate. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see, Regis, I think you took care of this question. Has USDA approved use of the No Kid Hungry eligibility map to determine rural status? Yes, they're aware of the map. And again, it's strictly based on USDA data, so it's all the same thing. A question that conditional site requirements sound similar to the conditions for closed enrolled sites and that they require individual eligibility to be verified. Can you explain the difference? This does get complicated, so it's a good question. I I will say one, you can do a closed enrolled site based on area eligibility. So there's that, and that's going to be out the window in any kind of situation where you're weighing closed enrolled versus conditional because you don't have that option of area eligibility. I guess the biggest difference is that there's no threshold that you have to meet to do a conditional site. So in a closed enrolled site, you have to determine kind of in advance that at least half of the kids qualify for free or reduced price meals. There's no threshold or anything like that in conditional sites. The difference there, though, is that in a closed enrolled site is that once you meet that 50% threshold, then you can serve meals at no cost to all the kids. So even if it's 51 out of 100 kids qualify for free or reduced price meals, you're still serving no cost meals to all 100. In a conditional site, again, maybe you only have 5 kids that qualify for free or reduced price meals. Assuming you had private funding to pay for meals, you could serve all 100 kids a meal, but you're only getting reimbursed for the 5 kids that met those requirements. So again, it's a little funky. In some ways, I feel like it makes the most sense with things like a school doing delivery to maybe just kids who qualify for free or reduced price meals. But again, you could have situations where you want to be able to do meals at a housing community that you know has a lot of low-income kids, but maybe you can't identify them in advance and it's not area eligible and you have a way to pay for meals no matter kind of who shows up. It's a possibility. So again, I know there are a lot of questions on it. I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that this is an option out there because I know state agencies are also still grappling with some of these questions and when it might make the most sense, and may not be putting out a ton of information about it while they still kind of think through these situations. So hopefully that helps to answer that question, even as it probably raises some more. Are the reimbursement rates set yet? Yes, I believe they are out, and we can dig that up and maybe send that as follow-up later. I don't have a link ready to go off the top of my head. So if I serve congregate to a summer program, say at 11 a.m., I could do a non-congregate summer school at 12 noon for them to take home. 2 times are needed as our cafeteria is not large enough to serve at the same time. I'm not positive I fully understand the situation, but generally speaking, you can do a congregate and non-congregate service at the same site as long as the congregate and non-congregate services are at different times serving different kids. So happy to chat more about a specific situation, but that's the general rule. And again, all of this I would discuss with your state agency because a lot of it, again, is subject to that state agency approval of what do they think of your system for ensuring that you are serving different groups of kids. Can a congregate snack be served and then a non-congregate lunch be served the same day from the same location? I think that's a little bit similar to what I was just talking about. And general, yes, I think that's also pretty clearly laid out as an example from USDA. That's okay to do one meal congregate in the day and then send home a non-congregate meal. I think it's slightly unclear exactly. I think they still have to be done technically at different times, that you have a congregate snack that's maybe 10 to 10:30, and then you can't start distributing those non-congregate lunches until 10:30 to 11. But by and large, yes, the same site can do both congregate and non-congregate for different meal services on the same day. If you are delivering from a rural non-congregate site that is eligible, what eligibility is required for families receiving the meals? So this depends, I guess, on the area eligibility of the distribution location. If the distribution location is rural, there's no congregate service available nearby it as determined by your state agency, and it's area eligible, you are not required to collect any kind of individual eligibility information from those families, similar to how technically families could travel from 10 miles away to get to a congregate site, and you're not asking them to fill out, personal eligibility information to get that congregate summer meal that's in an area eligible location. I think I saw a question somewhere in the chat potentially about home delivery, and I believe in those cases then the individual delivery addresses would all have to be area eligible, or you would have to get the individual income eligibility information of the family. But assuming you were all operating within an area eligible location that was rural, then you could deliver to all families in that service area that's area eligible and rural eligible. So I hope that helps to clarify that question. All right, I think I'm going to start going back through the chat because I know. All right, if we serve multiple days of breakfast and lunch, individual wrap items with a menu, will this qualify for multi-day instead of bulk? I believe that would be considered multi-day if the meals are individually set up. Again, it's when you would have a pan of pasta or something like that, and on Monday they're supposed to portion out some and add a marinara sauce, and on Tuesday they're going to portion some out and do something different with it. Or again, the loaf of bread example. So again, if things are packaged for each individual meal and individual day, that would qualify as just multiple meals or multiple unitized meals, and rather than bulk meals. Meal items not whole day together. Yeah, I think I'm answering that question sufficiently, but let me know, Randy, if not. Oh, someone else noted in the chat that they think bulk meals are only permitted for school food authorities. I did go back while Regis was chatting and double check, and I'll see if I can drop it in the chat without closing out my presentation. But I don't see any indication that that is true. That may have been something that a state agency added as a requirement last summer when state agencies had a lot more discretion on limiting those flexibilities. To my knowledge, bulk is equally available to nonprofits and school food authorities, again, and can only be limited on that case-by-case basis, based on the specific concerns around the model and the capacity and food safety concerns and things like that. Offer versus serve is one thing that is only permitted by schools, but that's a standard rule, whether congregate or non-congregate. Can you combine multiple meals and do 5 and bulk 5? That's a great question. I would talk about that with your state agency. You might be able to. That might be a way to get around it if you like doing bulk but want to be able to do more than 5 meals. Again, you could also ask for that case-by-case state agency approval to do 10 days of meals bulk style as well. What would be the appeals process if a state denies a site without a proper or debatable rationale? Oh, I got this question the other day and I should have looked it up. I believe in the case of denying a site or a sponsor, a state agency should provide appeal rights that would lay out the procedures then for submitting an appeal and there being a hearing officer within the state. I don't think it necessarily obligates USDA to go up to their regional or national office necessarily. Although there's definitely a chance that if someone submitted an appeal that maybe they would, I don't know. If you are having trouble, certainly do reach out to any contacts you have here or myself, and we can certainly look at it and try to think through, again, whether that's something that there may be room to push on, or again, was maybe squarely within the state's rights to determine. But certainly you should be able to ask for that rationale because again, USDA has said it should only be on a case-by-case basis rather than a blanket denial. One of the first questions we got in the chat at the beginning, is there a minimum or maximum number of sites that can be in a certain area? Generally speaking, there is not a set minimum or maximum anywhere. Again, on the minimum side, the state should be trying to identify areas with gaps and encouraging access in those areas with gaps. On the maximum side, that's really where you get into the state agency discretion of what it means to have no congregate service. And again, thinking about all those different factors of like, well, is the a site only serving a certain age group or meeting a certain dietary or cultural preference? Are there highways or mountains or rivers or other things like that that, you know, maybe require additional sites even for the same number of kids? All sorts of things like that. So there's not a set number. And I think there was also a question in the chat early on about a distance. And as I noted, there is no minimum distance set out in the IFR, and that is all left to state agency discretion for determining what it means to have no congregate service. And again, we know in some states last year, they said, as long as you're a quarter mile from a congregate site, we would assume that those kids more than a quarter mile away don't have access, and so you can do non-congregate. Other states said you had to be 10 miles away from a congregate site. So it can be a little bit all over the map. But again, the state is encouraged to think about some different factors. And again, then you could have a situation where you're even less than a quarter of a mile away, or again, you're maybe at the very same site and you're showing that you're serving different groups of kids and meeting different needs. If your school district is all CEP, which year's free and reduced data should be used? So in the case of CEP, what's generally done is you would look at the individual school's identified student percentage for the current school year and multiply that by 1.6 to kind of get the assumed free and reduced price eligibility rate for that individual school. And then you determine if that ISP times 1.6 is 50% or higher. But once you figure that out, again, that area eligibility determination is good for 5 years. So, you know, we know there have been some districts using CEP for more than 5 years. So if they had to go back to the last year before they did CEP, it would be too long ago. So that's why USDA says you look at the individual schools, identified student percentage, multiply by 1.6 and see if that's 50% or higher. Will subgroups and milk options still apply? That sounds like a question coming from a school food authority. And that will depend on whether or not you are participating in the seamless summer option through NSLP or the summer food service program. Those sound like requirements for the National School Lunch Program, so those would still apply in the seamless summer option, but in the summer food service program, those are different meal pattern requirements. Okay. Does the state have to provide a rationale to deny a non-congregate site? I guess that's a good question. I guess technically the regulations only say it's on a case-by-case basis. I think that would be a courtesy to explain what the case-by-case basis is. It's certainly, again, I think you're within your rights to ask what that rationale was for the case-by-case decision. But I suppose it is true that now that I think about it, that it is not a requirement for a state to explain necessarily what that was. I would just hope that's a courtesy states are extending to you. All right. Well, again, if there's anything that you would like to see change in this interim final rule as we go towards a final rule in the future, please do let me know. I have my contact information here at the end. Before we get to it, just briefly, I'll say, stay in touch, subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website, use our map that we just ran through, and register for upcoming webinars. This is the first in a series about non-congregate summer meals, so definitely make sure you're coming back for those in the coming weeks. And your feedback is appreciated. We'll send a 5-question survey that will open in your browser window, and we'd love it if you could take a moment to complete it so that we can make sure our future webinars best meet your needs. And yeah, with that, thank you so much for attending today. Here's my contact information. So again, if you have thoughts on the IFR or other follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I can put you in touch with Regis for all the questions on the map that I can't answer. And I'll certainly also be talking with Zach too, especially if you have questions specifically about whether you qualify as rural. So thank you again.